Thanks so much for being here. Merci beaucoup d'être ici. I want to thank our two presenters today, Colleen Fuller and Dr. Saad Ahmed. I want to lead off today. We have seen what the impact has been on our country when it came to light that we were unable to produce our own protective equipment. How people were outraged that we weren't able to produce, didn't have the capacity to make the masks, the protective equipment that our frontline workers needed, the gowns, and the fact that we were unable to obtain that locally. We had to rely on a supply chain that was in a lot of ways broken. That made people really worried. Similarly, now when we're seeing countries like the United Kingdom approve a vaccine and they are going to be able to produce it locally and be prepared to provide vaccines as early as next week. The United States as well will have vaccines very soon. Australia has indicated that they are able to produce millions of vaccines in their own country. And the fact that Canada does not have that capacity is completely wrong. It is directly the result of conservative governments that eliminated the capacity and liberal governments that failed to restore that capacity. And we are feeling the impact of it now with projections that we will have only enough vaccines to cover, to vaccinate 3 million Canadians, not nearly enough to cover all the vulnerable populations, frontline workers, seniors, Indigenous communities. So given that reality that we are not able to produce the capacity, we don't have the capacity to produce the medication we need in our own country, we are calling on officially today the establishment of a Crown Corporation, publicly owned, so that we can manufacture our own vaccines in Canada. This is something that we had in the past. In fact, insulin, we're around the anniversary of insulin, was discovered in Canada, produced in Canada, and now, years later, 100 years later, we do not have any production of insulin in our own country. Where it was discovered, we do not produce it. We know that there's critical shortages of some of the most vital and critical medication that people need, often cancer treatment medication. And we are critically low in supply. And this happens as a chronic problem. We need to be able to produce our own critical medication and vaccines in Canada. And this proposal is to build a public company, a Crown Corporation, that is publicly owned so that we can ensure that Canadians are safe. If we ever need to produce critical medication, we should be able to do it here at home. Donc, on a vu avec le fait que au début de la pandémie, on ne pouvait pas produire l'équipement protectif qu'on avait besoin. Et c'était incroyable de dépenser un pays assez grand que le nôtre, une économie assez forte que le nôtre, mais on ne pouvait pas produire l'équipement essentiel pour nos travailleurs de première ligne. C'est complètement incompréhensible, le fait qu'on n'avait pas la capacité de le faire. Les gens étaient tellement étonnés et fâchés par le fait qu'on n'avait pas cette capacité. Donc, les gens ont dit qu'on doit produire l'équipement comme ça chez nous, au Canada. Avec les vaccins, maintenant, on a des pays comme l'Angleterre où ils ont juste approuvé un vaccin. Ils ont la capacité de livrer le vaccin dans la prochaine semaine. Les États-Unis aussi, ils vont être prêts à livrer le vaccin bientôt. Et en Australie, un pays tellement similaire que le nôtre comme grandeur, c'est un pays où ils ont la capacité de produire des millions de vaccins. Donc, c'était la faute du gouvernement conservateur qui ont éliminé effectivement notre capacité de produire les vaccins chez nous. Et c'est aussi la faute des gouvernements libéraux qui n'ont pas restauré la capacité. Donc, aujourd'hui, on propose une société publique, une société d'État pour produire les vaccins et les médicaments essentiels chez nous. C'est fondamental qu'on peut faire ça, particulièrement pendant une pandémie, mais c'est une capacité importante pour notre souveraineté comme un pays. Donc, je suis tellement fier d'avoir des guests, des invités avec nous qui vont partager leur point de vue sur cette question. So, I'm really excited to be able to hear from these two folks, beginning with Colleen Fuller, an independent researcher in health and prescription drug policy. I look forward to hearing what Ms. Fuller has to say. Ms. Fuller, please begin.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to say a few words. I am in complete agreement that Canada needs a public vaccine and drug manufacturer. Ironically, as you were saying, we used to have a public manufacturer called Connaught. And Connaught was set up in 1914 for exactly the same reason that we need one today. At that time, there was a very serious diphtheria outbreak across the country, and Canada had to wait for other countries to have surpluses of the vaccine that we needed to prevent diphtheria. The city of Toronto asked the university for help, and the university set up Connaught to produce the diphtheria vaccine. And again, as you said, in 1921, insulin was discovered at Connaught, considered to be one of the most important medical discoveries in history. And in fact, the royalties from insulin went to support medical and scientific research at Canadian universities, in particular the University of Toronto. So Connaught played a key role in the development of a number of vaccines, polio, meningitis, and other vaccines. It played a key role in the campaign to eradicate smallpox around the world. But Connaught also played an important role in Canada. It supplied drugs and vaccines to Canadians at cost, and this was one of the key things that helped provinces establish public drug plans. And of course, it supported access to needed medicines. As you said, in the mid-1980s, the Mulroney government actually said that Connaught no longer served a public purpose and it was privatized. At that time, Albert Fisher, who was one of the key people at Connaught, warned that in the future, access by Canadians to vaccines would happen only when there was a surplus elsewhere. And of course, that's exactly where we are today. Not only do we import every drop of insulin needed by diabetics, but our Prime Minister has said that we don't have the capacity to produce a vaccine for the pandemic. So a lot of people have said that, this is wishful thinking. That was then, we're in the here and now. But other countries are confronting similar problems. In the US, the state of California has just passed legislation in October that enables it to produce generic drugs for its residents. So we may have missed the boat during this pandemic. This isn't going to be the last pandemic. And we have to have a plan for the future. So we should get started and start planning to develop a crown corporation to manufacture drugs and vaccines.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fuller. I really appreciate your words and telling the story of Connaught, Canadian story, something that we're really proud of, but also a tale that underlines the mistakes of the past of letting go of our capacity and then failures to restore that capacity and what that has meant right now for Canadians, the direct impact of those decisions made in the past. I want to bring in now Dr. Saad Ahmed. He's a rural physician and a lecturer at the U of T. He's also the co-founder of Critical Drugs Coalition to talk about what the capacity to manufacture vaccines and critical drugs would mean for Canada. Dr. Ahmed, thank you so much for joining, and please, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much for having me, Mr. Singh. The Critical Drugs Coalition is a nonpartisan and grassroots group of physicians and pharmacists, and we're worried about the shortages of critical drugs. We're worried about the delays in vaccinations from our lack of domestic manufacturing, and we're worried about the health and safety of our sickest patients. Now, I'm a rural physician. I work in many remote and underserved areas, and at the outset of the pandemic, I was actually asked to conserve and ration critical anesthetics. So I reached out to other colleagues and they told me that they were being asked to do the same. We were all worried about what this meant for our patients. When we looked into it, we actually found out that in the first week of May of 2020, 97% of pharmacists did not get their full shipment of drugs. And in fact, frontline pharmacists spend a quarter of their time dealing with drug shortages to prevent our healthcare system from collapsing. So, Canada's, and this is Health Canada's own stats, Canada's only 2% of the global market for drugs. We import 68% of our drugs, drugs like insulin, which are life-saving. And we really don't have the large-scale capacity to make the critical drugs that we depend on in ERs, in ICUs, and operating rooms. the shortages of these medications have ripple effects. They go across the entire system and they affect frontline care. And as you know, it's an issue that's persisted for a decade. It's been going on for a long time, but this crisis with the pandemic added so much stress to the fragile supply chains. And I would say that we dodged disaster mostly thanks to the creativity of our pharmacists. We're able to suggest alternatives for these critical drugs. So it's a complex issue. It's been going on for a while, but domestic manufacturing is a key part of the solution. And it's a key fact that we reiterated in an open letter to the Prime Minister in August. It was supported by the Canadian Medical Association and leading physicians at that time. A separate letter was sent by the Canadian Cancer Society last month, and they echoed our ask exactly, all three of them. And we've continued publishing op-eds and doing media to make it clear that drug shortages and vaccine supplies are a matter of domestic security and sovereignty. You know, securing our vaccine supply is as important as securing our drug supply. COVID-19 has mutated in the past year. It could mutate again. We don't know how long the protection from the vaccine will last for. And if this is going to be an annual shot like the influenza shot, then we really should secure its production. And you know, this is why I'm so glad that Jagmeet Singh and the NDP are speaking to this issue, because the anticipated delays in vaccination will mean further waves of COVID-19. They will mean further ICU admissions, and thus further reason to secure our drug and vaccine supply and keep our sickest patients safe. And that does start with domestic manufacturing for the short term and the long term.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed. I really appreciate that, particularly underlining how this has been a call of many of the experts in the health field, doctors, coalitions of doctors, people that are some of the most vulnerable cancer patients. This has been a call from a number of organizations. We need to be able to supply not just the vaccines, and it's a very critical point that Dr. Ahmed touched on, but the critical medication, where we've seen a decade of drug supply shortages. This is vital for our healthcare system to be able to produce these essential critical medications domestically. This is about our sovereignty, and I think that's a really important point to note. Our ability to function as an independent sovereign nation, we have to be able to provide the medication that our citizens, that our people need. Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed. I'm going to pass it now to Nina, who will take us to the next phase for questions. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jagmeet. Merci, Jagmeet. We'll now start the question period. Nous allons maintenant commencer la période de questions. As usual, one question, one follow-up. We'll start with 3 questions on the phone before turning to the room. Comme d'habitude, une question et une question de suivi. Nous allons commencer avec 3 questions au téléphone avant d'en prendre dans la salle. Please identify yourself before asking your question. S'il vous plaît, identifiez-vous avant de poser votre question. Operator, could we have a first question on the phone, please?
Thank you. Merci. If you have a question, please press star 1 on your device's keypad. Si vous désirez poser une question, s'il vous plaît, appuyez sur les touches étoiles 1 de votre appareil. La première question est de Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir. À vous.
Oui, bonjour, M. Singh. Vous me permettrez de changer un petit peu de sujet. Je voulais parler avec vous de l'aide médicale à mourir. Le débat s'allonge un peu à la Chambre des communes et il y a beaucoup de conservateurs, par exemple, qui prennent la parole alors que les autres partis ont cessé de parler. Comment voyez-vous les choses? Avez-vous peur qu'on rate le délai du 18 décembre? Merci.
Donc, c'est toujours une question difficile avec l'aide médicale au mourir. Je pense que c'est une décision tellement difficile pour les familles, les individus de faire. C'est une décision qu'on appuie et je comprends maintenant il y a des graves inquiétudes par rapport à la communauté des Canadiens handicapés. C'est une question de manque de ressources et d'appui pour eux. Et comme néo-démocrates, on comprend cette crainte et on va continuer de lutter pour plus d'appui, plus d'aide aux Canadiens qui vivent avec un handicap. Et on pense que ce choix difficile doit être vraiment un choix où si quelqu'un a besoin de cette choix, ils auront dû avoir accès. Donc, on appuie cette idée, mais on comprend les inquiétudes des communautés des Canadiens handicapés.
excusez-moi, mais ma question c'était, je comprends la préoccupation à laquelle vous faites référence. Les conservateurs en parlent d'ailleurs beaucoup, mais selon vous, est-ce que c'est en train de devenir une excuse de la part de ceux qui de toute façon s'opposent à l'aide médicale à mourir pour prolonger peut-être inutilement ou en tout cas pas de manière nécessaire ce débat-là et faire en sorte qu'on rate le deadline?
Oui, je suis reconnaissant de la deadline et comme dans mon avis personnel et comme chef de parti, c'est une décision, c'est un droit qu'il faut appuyer en considérer les inquiétudes de communautés handicapées. Et oui, je comprends, il y a un deadline et je comprends l'importance de cette décision.
Opérateur, notre prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Richard Sussman, Global, British Columbia. Please go ahead.
Is that Mr. Sussman himself?
Thank you so much for taking my question. It is me. It
Wow.
is me. I am here in British Columbia.
Wow.
So I'm going to change the topic a little bit on you because of issues that are of note here in British Columbia. One of the things that continues to come up here is Premier Horgan called on the federal government to create a national sick day program. That program doesn't seem to be working as intended. Can you speak to some of your concerns around whether people that need access to the national sick day program are actually getting it? You know, we're hearing a lot of stories here about people having to continue to take unpaid days, and that is leading, obviously, to pressures around childcare and other issues.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So this is something that we believe that any worker who is sick in this pandemic should be able to stay at home and be able to access paid sick leave. We expanded the definition so that people who have COVID-like symptoms can take access of this program. We wanted this to be a broad paid sick leave for all Canadians, period. As soon as someone is sick, they should be able to take access to this service. And that's what we had intended. The Liberals limited it, but it's still a program that should be used by anyone who has COVID-like symptoms or COVID. They should be able to access it. No one should have to make the impossible choice of going to work sick or staying at home. That's why we fought for this. That's why we fought to bring it in. And I have to acknowledge that Premier Horgan was very vital. The fact that Premier Horgan joined and raised this issue, we were able to fight for it at the federal level, and we were able to achieve it. But it should be something that people are able to access. I have heard similar concerns about the struggles and challenges accessing it, but it should be really clear. I'm hoping folks are listening. This needs to be a service that anyone who is sick with any COVID-like symptoms should be able to stay at home and get the support they need so they can stay at home, take care of their kids, and not risk exposing their coworkers.
Is there any hope that that will change in terms of including more people as people are being asked to stay home for, sore throats, sniffles, that they aren't necessarily COVID, but out of abundance of caution? Like, is there any hope that we may, or do you think it should be up to the provinces to help supplement some of these programs?
Well, I want to be very clear. I believe what should be in place is a paid sick leave for all Canadian workers, and this is the first step towards that. I want to see a permanent program for all Canadians, for all, anytime someone's sick, they should be able to stay at home and get paid sick leave. That's what I want to work towards. That's what I'm working towards. The current paid sick leave program that's in existence does include an addition for COVID-like symptoms. So I would encourage people, in order to be safe and stop the spread, if you have any COVID-like symptoms and if you qualify in the broadest sense to the program that is available, please make use of it so you can stay at home. It is good for yourself, your family, and for your coworkers, but it is impossible if people don't have paid sick leave to make that choice. So that's why this paid sick leave is so vital in the recovery right now, in handling the outbreaks and the increasing numbers. That is what I hope people use it for, and I will continue to fight to make sure it is as broad as possible and covers as many Canadians as possible.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Mia Radson, the Canadian Press. Line open.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm wondering, this morning, Dr. Tam, or maybe an hour ago, Dr. Tam was talking about the fact that the 6 million doses we're expecting in the first 3 months of next year won't be enough to really even get through the full prioritization groups that we've talked about, and that they're sort of in the works of refining that list now. How concerning is that to you, and who do you think should get the vaccine first?
So first of all, this is very, very concerning. This is exactly why we've been saying Canada, specifically the Liberal government, has massively failed when it comes to the vaccine. We look at countries similar to Canada, Australia, similar size, similar population. This is a country that has the capacity, or they've negotiated to produce the vaccine in their own country. We've got England and the United States that will have access to a vaccine very shortly. England just approved the vaccine, and that means that they will be delivering, according to reports, as soon as next week. They will be delivering vaccines. And the fact that Canada will only have 6 million, which medical experts say is only really going to cover 3 million Canadians. So there is no clear plan. Who is going to receive the vaccine? What choices is this government going to make? What is the rollout going to look like? All these questions are still unanswered. The government has not provided these details, and they should. And you can look at Australia's website, and the plan is transparently there every step of the way. What's going on? The fact that Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government haven't given us a clear plan is a failure of leadership on their part. On top of that, what we're talking about today is because Liberals and Conservatives failed, one, they destroyed our capacity, and then they failed to restore our capacity to produce our own vaccines. That is directly going to mean that more people will get sick. We will have to go through this pandemic for longer. This is directly going to impact Canadians. And that's why today's call for a publicly owned Crown corporation producing vaccines and critical medication in our own country is vital. Sadly, it won't help us in this pandemic, but it is something we need to be prepared for the future so that we're not in this situation, as you described, where 3 million people will get the first dose and there is no clear plan of who those people will be. And it doesn't cover some of the most vulnerable. There's more than 4.5 million seniors over the age of 70, so it doesn't cover all seniors. It certainly won't cover all the Indigenous communities and frontline workers combined. So there are some serious problems with the Liberals' plan when it comes to the vaccine.
Thank you. And in terms of my follow-up, you're talking about a Crown corporation to produce vaccines and I guess other drugs. I'm just curious how this would be different than the expanded NRC facility that they're building in Montreal right now, where they're expecting to be able to produce millions of doses of vaccine maybe by the end of next year.
Right. So what we're proposing is completely publicly owned. So the goal of this would be specifically and directly to provide Canadians with the medication we need. We should not be reliant on Big Pharma. And we've seen that Big Pharma, they will not make decisions that are in the best interest of Canada. We need to have full control over the production for Canadians of vital medication. This is something that we had the capacity to do in the past, and it directly improved our healthcare. Dr. Ahmed had talked about the lack of critical drugs, the shortages, because of the fact we do not have that capacity in Canada. Colleen Fuller, my apologies, mentioned how we are directly suffering as a result of the fact that we no longer produce things like insulin. Something that was discovered in Canada, we no longer produce it here. So this is about having the capacity to be able to produce vital vaccines and medication in our own country for the good of Canadians, strictly with that goal. What's being proposed, other private sources or private-public relationships will not have the same capacity to be fully focused on helping Canadians and have Canadians' interests at heart.
We'll now take 3 questions in the room. Nous allons maintenant prendre 3 questions dans la salle.
Abigail Beeman, Global News. Hi, Mr. Singh. I understand your call for a Crown corporation, but given that we don't have one right now, I'm wondering what you would have done or would do differently in terms of specifically procurement or rollout of the vaccine.
Certainly. Well, one, I think that we can look to similar countries. Like I give the Australia example. You can literally pull up their entire plan. That plan should have been provided to Canadians transparently. We could look at it, evaluate it, and have the confidence. If it's a good plan, then we could have the confidence. If there was problems, we could have pointed those out. But to date, the Liberal government, Justin Trudeau, has not rolled out a clear plan. That's one massive problem. That plan should have been rolled out clearly. What are the steps? And just to counter some of the arguments I know the Liberals will bring up, they'll say, well, we don't know which vaccines are going to be successful. That was included in the Australia plan. They mark out, if this vaccine is successful, here's our plan. If it's not, this alternative, if that's successful, here's the plan. That is what we expect of a country. So that's one. Secondly, and I'm concerned that the Liberal government is closely aligned with Big Pharma, and they did not negotiate the ability to produce the vaccines in our country. Now, this is very important because if you secure the contracts for a vaccine without including a clause that not only do we want the vaccine, but it should be produced in Canada, then we are subject to the whims of other countries producing it, and it'll naturally put us lower down in the list. So that means we will have to wait. That means more people will get sick. So those are just two basic things that should have been done. A clear plan laid out well in advance, and then negotiate so we can produce it in Canada. These things were failures. I also, from the beginning, we should have restored our capacity years and years ago. That's something that now I'm hoping to do with today's announcement.
And you commented on the Pfizer development in the UK. I'm wondering if you can expand on that, what you think of that news and the fact that Health Canada has not approved it in Canada.
Well, I do want to acknowledge that we have a very robust and independent approval process, which is the right way to do things. It should be independent. It should be science-based and evidence-based. But really what this speaks to is the fact that in the UK, they've made the plans to have access to the vaccine so quickly. And I look at the fact that they're going to roll out as soon as a week. And in Canada, we are not certain what that plan is. We don't even know who's going to receive the first wave of the vaccine. The first wave of the vaccine doesn't cover the priorities outlined by our own public experts, public health experts, and is clearly insufficient. So there's just been a colossal failure in terms of securing not just the agreement, but the production capacity in Canada. And then on top of that, making sure the rollout is based on the best evidence and the best practices. All these things are failures that the Liberal government has to wear.
Hi, Mr. Singh, Mackenzie Gray. Today in the U.S., the CDC shortened the quarantine period from 14 days to a period of 7 to 10 days. Many other countries have done the same thing, dropping it to 7 days. Is that something you'd support here in Canada?
Well, again, I would take the lead on this one from our public health experts. I respect and trust that they will make some good recommendations. I think it's fair to say that as we learn more about the disease, more information will come forward. But I want to trust, again, instead of my opinion on this, I want to trust the best evidence on this and hear that recommendation before we make a decision.
I want to go back to Mia's question and your response to that. The NRC already has a plan to produce a fairly substantial amount of vaccines moving into 2021. My understanding is all of the vaccines produced there would be done by a Canadian government organization for the Canadian public. So why do we need a Crown corporation to do something that the government is already doing?
So effectively, they're not doing what we're proposing. They're proposing a single product for this time in this moment. What we're proposing is for now and moving forward permanently, we need a public institution, that public Crown corporation that produces medication for Canadians exclusively and always. What the Liberal government is talking about is a one-time injection of funds to do something in this pandemic, but not an ongoing solution, not an ongoing commitment to publicly produce essential, vital medications and vaccine. That's actually what we need to do. We need an ongoing commitment that we have the capacity and the ability to not do this as a one-off, but as a permanent thing. And that's been a failure of Liberal and Conservative governments. They don't think about planning for the future. They plan in the short term. And we know from medical experts that we will have future pandemics, that this is not the last one. And if we are only focused on solutions that are short term, we will not be ready for the next one. I want to build a sustainable and durable economy, one that is working for people and one that has basic things in place, which is the capacity to produce vaccines and medication for Canadians exclusively with the interests of Canadians in mind, something that will do that on an ongoing basis, not a one-off. That's what we're talking about today, to not have a public-private partnership, fully public, owned by Canadians, for Canadians, to build and manufacture the type of medication we need now and moving forward.
Hello, Mr. Singh, Mal Hamidi from the Canadian Press. Minister Miller today gave more details on their promise to provide $1.5 billion for the boil water advisories in Indigenous communities. Now, the government obviously won't meet its deadline of to lift all these advisories by March next year. What in your opinion, what does say about the way the government is dealing with Indigenous issues in general, and how do you think of the government approach of saying that we have to provide support on an ongoing basis for years to come, not to have a strict deadline and then leave communities on their own? So what do you think of this approach?
No, I really appreciate the question. I can't imagine a minister. Imagine Minister Miller going to his riding of Montreal and telling the people of Montreal, I apologize, but we missed our deadline to get you clean drinking water. Would he ever think that it would be appropriate to apologize for that in his riding if it was about people in Montreal not getting clean drinking water? This is not a broken promise. This is a betrayal of trust, and it sends a message that Indigenous people don't matter, a message that they've heard again and again. This is frankly disgusting for the Liberal government to make a promise and to break it and to think that they could just walk up and apologize for it. You can't apologize. It's inexcusable. There's no apologies that anyone can accept for not making sure people have clean drinking water. This Liberal government jumped to give almost $200 billion. I think it was $175 billion to banks right when the pandemic started. They bought a pipeline for billions of dollars. And now they're promising the sum that's needed to make sure there's clean water. Well, what happened 6 years ago? What happened 2 years ago? This government has failed people. And I think about B. Muniaz. Is a young woman, she's 9 years old, a young girl from the Niskantaga community that doesn't only have a lack of clean drinking water, they've just been forced to evacuate because the water is just completely unusable. And she was quoted in the newspaper saying that she feels like she's a ghost put in a box in a drawer. It's like, we don't matter. Like basically she's saying that we feel like we don't matter. That's what this means. That's what it means to a 9-year-old kid who's being told that she can't go back to her home community. That's not excusable.
Did you have a follow-up? No, okay. I'm just going to go back to the phone, and then I'm coming back here. Operator, is there any other questions on the phone?
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Cormac McSweeney, City News. Line open.
And I want to ask you about a petition that is on the House of Commons website, sponsored by Conservative MP Derek Sloan. It basically questions the safety of the COVID-19 vaccine, but also says that the vaccine is effectively human experimentation. I just want to get your reaction to the fact the MP has sponsored this bill, and what do you think should happen with Derek Sloan?
That's embarrassing, frankly. And it's the type of stuff that happens in the States. And we hope that at a minimum, we all agree on basic science. You know, there is no question that one of the greatest achievements that we've been able to do and to fight all the major, and we've got experts here that talked about our ability to fight some of the worst illnesses has been through vaccination. That's how we have people that are no longer infected by diseases that would kill people, ruin people's lives, and we've been able to fight that with vaccines. The fact that someone would question the legitimacy of something that is so important and so valid, so on an evidence basis supported, is embarrassing. That's an embarrassment, and I hope that that type of thinking is rejected soundly, and that we encourage people to follow the best medical advice and the experts' advice around getting vaccinated and getting the medication or getting the vaccine necessary so that we can fight this pandemic as well.
And as a follow-up on your announcement today, setting aside the questions that have already been asked about possibly doubling up of efforts, if the government were to set up a Crown corporation focused on vaccine production, how much would that cost, and how long before you think it would be operational?
We looked at some costing, and we'll be able to provide you with some details, but it is something that is very cost effective. It's something that we would be able to have up and running fairly quickly. Sadly, not quick enough for this current pandemic, but for future pandemics. And I want to be very clear, this is not at all what the government's proposing. Their proposal is not to put in place the capacity to be able to produce vaccines and critical medication on an ongoing basis. That is not what I've ever heard the Prime Minister ever state. That is not at all what they're suggesting. They've got a plan, which in fact, they broke their own plan. So I don't know how much trust we can have in it. They said we would have, the Liberal government, and specifically Prime Minister Trudeau, said we would have the capacity by August to produce millions of vaccines in Canada, and then said we will not have the capacity in Canada. So again, I don't know how much we can value or put worth or put merit into a promise that was self-contradicted by the Prime Minister himself. So he says he's doing it on one hand and then says it's not able to happen on the other. So I don't think we can put much merit on that. What we're proposing is a fully committed public Crown Corporation that will make vaccines and critical drugs for Canadians, and only with that focus in mind. That is completely separate, something we've had in the past and we need to have again. It is something we can achieve, and it is absolutely affordable, and it is vital, in fact, for us to be able to do it.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Tom McCharles, Toronto Star. Line open.
Sorry, my apologies. I was thinking maybe because we've got Colleen Fuller and Miss Dr. Ahmed, would they have any, by chance, estimates of how much would it take to start up this type of? Yes, I see Dr. Ahmed saying yes. Maybe we can get a quick answer from Dr. Ahmed. You're on mute. If you could just.
Oh, okay, perfect. So we have done some homework on this, and a multi-product facility, sterile multi-product facility to make critical medications, just excluding vaccines just for a moment, would probably be about $50 million. So it's not an exorbitant cost for sure. And then vaccines, you'd probably be adding a similar amount onto such a facility.
Thank you. So roughly between, I wanted to say the number, but I wasn't absolutely confident. But so between 50 to $100 million for a facility that was both able to produce vaccines and critical medication. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. Did you want to add anything, Ms. Fuller, or is that good? Getting a thumbs up there? No. Okay. Thanks so much. Yes. Sorry. My apologies. Please.
Hi, Mr. Singh. Our voices are bouncing back to us, so that's a bit distracting. But anyway, so it's not clear, because we haven't yet been able to speak to Mr. Sloan, whether he personally endorses the anti-vaccine views that are suggested in that petition. So I'd like to understand from your perspective, so what is the role of an MP in presenting anti-vaccine views to Parliament and demanding action? Is there a role for that? And do you think, I guess, what impact do you think this kind of petition might have on the public discourse?
I think there's some things that are dangerous to do for public health, and I think it's dangerous for someone to say when people are saying it's clearly going to save lives if you wear a mask. If someone comes out and says don't wear a mask, they're putting people at risk, and so I think it's dangerous to say that. And I think public elected officials have a responsibility to protect the public and have to support what the evidence states it's going to save lives. So putting out a message that is contrary to the public health guidelines could be dangerous, and that's why it's a problem. And so when we know that vaccines are clearly a path to us tackling this pandemic, they will absolutely save lives. They will save lives for vulnerable people. I think it's really important for public officials, elected officials, to support the evidence-based medical advice and to promote that so that we have people that are following the good advice. It's already tough enough with lots of misinformation out there. And if you've got an elected official that doubles down on misinformation or gives it some space, I think it's dangerous, especially when we're in a pandemic. I think there's a time and a place to talk about, what type of debate is appropriate when we're in a pandemic. I think this is a type of debate that is going to do more harm than good. And it's important for us to support the advice, the evidence-based advice that's out there, and make sure people know that this is good advice and this will save lives. I think it's very vital that that information is known to people, and that we clearly criticize or shut down the type of rhetoric that's going to put people at risk.
Thanks. And the other question I have is from some of the earlier comments at the outset of your statement, or of your news conference, but perhaps your experts can even fill me in here. But I want to understand, in terms of your criticism of the loss of capacity here in Canada, is it your understanding that because these new technologies, the messenger RNA type vaccines, are deemed to be novel platforms, is it your understanding then that there is absolutely no capacity in Canada, or that Canada could get a hold of in order to, you said we should have negotiated the ability to make this for ourselves, but even if we didn't negotiated that, given the new technologies, do your experts see that there's any way that Canada could have done that?
That's a very fair question. And I wouldn't know the details of what that is, but I know that other countries have negotiated the ability to produce it. It was a part of the requirement. I think that would be pretty vital. But I think it goes to our initial point. That is a very valid question. That's why we're saying, to put those questions to rest, we need to be able to produce vital, critical medication and vaccines in our own country. We need to have a committed Crown corporation, publicly owned, with that sole focus that they are going to produce medication for the interests of Canadians. That has to be something we have, a capacity we have. Same way people were wondering, why is it that a country, 10th largest economy in the world, a country like Canada, couldn't produce our own protective equipment? Now, that was a serious problem. Similarly, we need to be able to produce the medication that our citizens, that are the people in Canada need. We need to be able to have that capacity. And so that's why this announcement today, I think, is very important, very relevant to the struggles that we're facing right now.
Do your experts have a comment?
Yes, I do. Yes, the other problem here is that not only do we not build in this ability into the arrangements with pharmaceutical manufacturers, but Canada also voted against a waiver on intellectual property at the World Trade Organization in October. And so the IP waiver was a motion put forward by South Africa and India, and it would have, if it had passed, it would have enabled countries that don't have the capacity to produce vaccines and other medications that would be vital to treating COVID-19. We voted against that, and so we undermined our ability to take advantage of an IP waiver to begin manufacturing a vaccine in Canada. This is inexplicable why our representatives at the World Trade Organization took that position, undermining our position, undermining the interests of Canadians and protecting the interests of the pharmaceutical industry.
We will take one last question in the room.
It's Abigail Beeman from Global News again. Hi, my question is for Dr. Ahmed, if that's all right. Dr. Ahmed, I'm wondering if you can tell us what community you're speaking to us from and whether you have any specific concerns about vaccine rollouts in rural communities like the one that you're working in.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'm actually at my parents' house in Ottawa, but I work in a number of rural communities, such as Moose Factory, Englehart, Kenora, so many remote and rural communities across Ontario where we cover for a couple of weeks at a time. So the logistics of this, I'm glad that the government has announced the names that it has. This is going to require a pretty big push for us on the front lines to deliver the vaccines. The Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, they require -70, -80 freezers. And there was just an article published in the British Medical Journal today about what that will mean for logistics. But definitely direct you there. It'll probably mean large vaccination centers with the ability to host a -70 to 80 freezer, right? Which is quite different than traditional vaccines like the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which can just sit in any fridge that almost every single hospital have, including in the communities that I work in. So what that actually means for us is, there certainly might be challenges, and it'll be interesting to see how it's addressed with getting these, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine out to rural and remote communities and to vulnerable populations in rural and remote communities. That's definitely, I don't know how we're going to do that, but I'll be interested to hear.
So when the government says that, when a vaccine is ready, Canada will be ready, do you take that to include ready for rural and remote communities as well?
Devil's in the details, right? So implementation of of a vaccine that we've never delivered at a temperature that we've never transported, and delivering it within hours of defrosting, that is going to be a challenge. I certainly hope the communication is clear and everyone is trained in how to do that so we don't lose valuable vaccine stocks. But these are the sorts of things that when you're actually delivering something like this in a rural and remote setting will be quite challenging.
This concludes.
I'm sure that we will figure it out.
Awesome. Thank you very much. This concludes the press conference. Thank you. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.